Good afternoon. Welcome to week 5 of the NIH grant writing series. Again, my name is Maggie Berg. I'm a research development manager at IHSI. And because we are in Champaign-Urbana, I would like to begin, as we have every week, by recognizing and acknowledging that we are on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Mascoutin, Odawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. These lands were the traditional territory of these native nations prior to their forced removal. These lands continue to carry the stories of these nations and their struggles for survival and identity. As a land-grant institution, the University of Illinois has a particular responsibility to acknowledge the peoples of these lands, as well as the histories of dispossession that have allowed for the growth of this institution for the past 150 years. We are also obligated to reflect on and actively address these histories and the role that this university has played in shaping them. This acknowledgement and the centering of Native peoples is a start as we move forward for the next 150 years. So I'm going to move on to the poll to find out who's here and find out knowledge of the proposal writing process. So I'm launching that now. Everyone will just take a second to fill that out. Okay, looks like we have just about everybody. Yep, everybody. So I'm going to end the poll. And it looks like we have a lot of staff here today, followed by some postdocs and assistant professors. Great. And average knowledge of the NIH proposal writing process. So, and some people said poor. So hopefully there'll be a lot of good information for you today. So we're going to be talking about the other sections that are outside of the research plan today, kind of finishing up talking about the actual writing process of the proposal. We have Jeff Woods and Patty Jones joining us. Jeff will be presenting and Patty will be contributing to the discussion throughout. I'm going to turn this over to them and let them introduce themselves and give a little summary of their experience with the NIH. All right, so Jeff.
Hey, thanks, Maggie. This is great. It's good to see everybody here. I recognize some names in the list of people that have joined so far. So my name's Jeff Woods. If I can get my slide to advance. I want to jump to the next one. Oh, here we go. Did it advance, Maggie? Okay, thank you. So my name is Jeff Woods. I'm an Associate Dean for Research in the College of Applied Health Sciences. I'm also a working professor. So in addition to administration, I also write grants. In fact, I broke today from a grant proposal so I could be with you. I've been around since, on campus since 1994, all here at the University of Illinois, which by the way is a great place. And I'm very loyal to Illinois and Illinois has been loyal to me. As a researcher, I've been awarded a little over $6 million as a principal investigator. As a co-investigator, probably about $22 million. So I've been involved in a lot of funded research on campus. I've experienced a diverse funding portfolio. I've had NIH funding all the way from when I was an assistant professor. I had something called an R29, which many of you probably aren't familiar with, but it was kind of like a K award, I guess. I've had R01s. I've had actually just got a R56, which is an interesting mechanism. That's a mechanism where if you get a fairly good score but aren't funded, they'll give you like one year of funding to build up the specific data and actually resubmit. I've also had industry funding from Abbott Nutrition and from other places, and so I feel like I've got a good sense of what it takes to submit a successful proposal, which is probably why I'm asked to be here with you today. Just a little bit about my research. I'm a kinesiologist in the Department of Kinesiology and Community Health. I study how exercise, physical activity, and nutrition affect the immune system and the gut microbiome in aging and disease. Our lab was the first to show that exercise independently of diet could affect the microbiome. Also, we've demonstrated that exercise can improve influenza vaccine responses in older adults. So those are kind of two seminal findings from our lab. I do both human research and animal research, so I'm very familiar with all the regulatory issues that are required of investigators that do those types of research. So be it an experimental human study, a clinical trial, or experimentation with animals. So I can answer any questions you might have. So with that, I'll let Patty introduce herself.
Great, thanks, Jeff. Hello, everybody. I'm Patty Jones. I'm the Associate Director for Research at Beckman. I've been in this job for 8 years, and during that time, I have worked with a number of different investigators on their NIH proposals. And I'm also the supervisor of the core facilities at Beckman, so I'm familiar with some of the facility and other kinds of information that would be potentially part of proposals. In my previous life, I used to be a professor of engineering, and so my direct experience as a PI is more with NSF and DoD, but I've learned a lot from being in this series and learning from people like Jeff. So welcome, everybody, and look forward to a great talk today.
Thanks, Patty. Look forward to your chiming in. So really, I think the goal today is to talk about everything but the research strategy. So these are all the other parts. And I guess one thing I want to convey to you is don't take these parts less seriously than the research strategy. The research strategy is the main thing that the reviewers are going to look at, the 12 pages or 6 pages, whatever grant mechanism you're applying to. That should be the bulk of the proposal. That should be the document that you spend the most amount of time on. But these other parts are very important. And so you can see on this slide just some of the other sections that are listed here. The abstract and project narrative we'll talk about. The biosketches, you probably already have a biosketch, but we'll talk about those. Letters of support, the cover letter, the assignment request. The NIH actually has a portal now. You can go in and make a request for assignment. Compliance sections, the facilities and resources pages, resource and data sharing plan pages, subawards, budget and budget justification. So, so many forms, so little time, right? Which really is my mantra you'll hear today is start early. Start early and work on these things, because it's very frustrating when you get down to the end and you've got all of these forms you got to fill out and you don't do your due diligence, and you miss an opportunity to sell your grant in the best light possible if you don't use these other sections to also address some of the reviewer points that need to be addressed. So for instance, budget, that has to be started early. Request for letters of support. Anything, I guess the bottom line is anything that you're asking others to help you with or you're asking others to do first. Do early. Get it on their radar, because you need them to help you. And if you don't start early, they're not going to be able to help you, or you're going to get them mad and they will, say, well, you didn't give me any time to do that. So I think that, if you take away nothing from this section today, don't give these other parts just a token amount of your time. Start them early, and make sure that if you need help from somebody, that you do start early. So there'll be some time after several slides where I'll break, and I don't know how Maggie wants to handle the questions, but you can either do it in the chat box or unmute yourself, but we'll see how that goes. So my advice for working on these sections is do not blow these off till the last minute, especially maybe not the abstract so much, but certainly the support letters and the budget. That needs to be started fairly early. You need to, one of the main mistakes a lot of investigators do is they don't read the RFA. And so it's really important to read your RFA and understand what's being asked of you and what this research request for proposals are all about. We have a grant specialist in our college that works with investigators, and she certainly reads through the RFA, but don't let that be the only person that reads the RFA in your for your grant. So you should read the RFA. So that should be one of the first things you do. All these other forms, some require some degree of creativity, others and maybe not so much. So I would suggest, as some advice, to use kind of your non-creative times during the day to work on these sections. So, I know for me, and maybe it's the same for you, that if I'm writing and heavily writing a manuscript or a proposal, I like to have blocks of time, significant blocks of time, maybe a couple, 3 hours or more. Because a lot of times I'm reading while I'm writing, I'm reading an article, say, oh yeah, that I need to do that, put that in here. And that requires time. And so, you have some control over your Google Calendar. You can block in the times, and I definitely would suggest to do that. But some of these forms require a little bit less creativity. So I guess my suggestion is to, if you like to write late in the day or early in the morning, set aside those parts of the day to do your research strategy and some of the main body of the proposal, and then your less creative times of day or times when you only have like an hour or 45 minutes to work on something for these other forms. At least that strategy has worked for me. So you can try that. Another piece of advice I would give you is do not use these forms to make an end run around the page limits. So in other words, you need to have everything in the research strategy section that is needed for a reviewer to critically evaluate your work. You can refer to these other things, these other forms, for additional details, but the main points need to be in the research strategy. What you don't want to do is just have something like, oh, see, facilities and resources, or see this over there, You don't want to ship the reviewer off to another document when they're, kind of reading through your 12-page narrative, research strategy, and then all of a sudden they're like, what do I got to go here for? Why don't you give me a little information about, for instance, the research environment right here, and then say, refer to the research environment section or something like that. So I think that's a good strategy, and don't use it to not put information in your research strategy section. So I guess bottom line is important information needs to be in the research strategy, but you can refer to these other sections or other documents for the smaller details. I think that's the point I want to convey. So it's important to understand, I think, how these other documents are reviewed in terms of the review criteria for NIH. So listed across the top here are the 5 criteria that NIH reviewers score to come up with your overall summary score. Significance, innovation, investigator, approach, and environment. So significance, which really relates to does the project address an important problem or a critical barrier to progress in the field? If the aims of the project are achieved, how will scientific knowledge, technical capability, and/or clinical practice be improved? And how will successful completion of the aims change the concepts, methodologies, technologies, treatment services, or preventative interventions that drive the field? So those are the questions that really are related to significance. And of these other documents, the proposal abstract and the proposal narrative should address significance. So again, there's a purpose to these other documents where you can drive home more value in terms of the reviewer critique. You can show them another place where this, another document where, significance can be highlighted, or innovation. So innovation, are the, does the application challenge and seek to shift the current or clinical research practice paradigms? Point that out in your abstract, in your narrative, in addition to the research strategy, right? So you absolutely have to point out all 5 of these criteria and address them in the research strategy. But in the other documents, the abstract and the narrative can certainly be used to highlight significance and innovation. Investigators, certainly the biosketch is a primary source of information for who's doing this work. The letters of support also, and we'll talk about those. The facilities section, facilities and equipment, and the resources section. So all those kind of speak to, usually both investigator, but also the environment, the column on the criteria on the far right. What's your research environment, and how do these documents relate to that? And you can see the documents there that do relate to environment. And then the approach. The budget and budget justification, the human subject section, whether you have vertebrate animal section or not, whether it's a clinical trial and you need to fill in other forms as well, and the resource section can all be used to address some of the questions under the review criteria of approach. So let's kind of go through each of the individual pieces quickly. In some instances, I'll show you an example, but at the end of this slide deck, there are good examples of all of these sections, so you can use those kind of as a template. You know, I usually work with others and look at their work if they will share it. So certainly if you have a mentor on campus or you know, somebody you've worked with in the past that's willing to share some of these documents, so you can kind of take a look at them and use them as a template to kind of see how they write their sections. That's certainly recommended. So the project summary or abstract really categorizes the application and describes the key focus. This and the narrative are used by NIH program people to describe the project. And this could affect the outcome of your grant if you're on the bubble, if this is the only thing that program people are looking at, in addition to obviously the review. So you really want this to be a nice standalone document. It's going to highlight the long-term objectives and the specific aims, but it really shouldn't be a rehash of your specific aims page. It should be a separate abstract. It should be able to stand on its own apart from the other section we'll talk about in a second, the narrative. This abstract should describe the research design and methods briefly, because you're not going to have a lot of space, highlighting certainly anything that's particularly novel so that you can address innovation, right? You should reference the health relatedness of the project and its relevance to the mission of NIH. And in particular, you might want to address, you know, how it might be relevant to one of the institutes that you're applying for, like diabetes or, you know, arthritis or something like that. And, you know, you need to be concise. So every word counts, no more than 30 lines of text for this document. Importantly, it should be understandable to both the disciplinary scientists who are reviewing your grant, but also to any lay people. So people that on the program staff at NIH, for instance. I wouldn't include any proprietary or confidential information in this section, like you might in the research strategy, because this abstract will become public verbatim if the grant is awarded. So this will be kind of the public face of your grant if you get an award. If people go to search you and find out what funding you've got, they'll click on it and they'll find this abstract. So, you know, this abstract needs to be good. I would avoid describing past accomplishments in this. So it's all about this research project. Many of you maybe have used NIH Reporter. So this is a tool that you can search to find out what's funded at NIH, either by study section, by PI's name, by topic. So you can find all of this information publicly available through what's called the NIH Reporter. And you can look that up. But that's where these abstracts would be found. Okay, I've got a sticky key. So let me see how many times I hit it before the slide change. Yep. Project narrative. So this document is really short. It's a 3-sentence maximum. So what you need to do in this document is describe the research relevance and potential to improve public health. So it's kind of like your overall aim relative to health, which of course is important to the NIH. How will the project contribute to the fundamental knowledge about the behavior and or nature of living systems? How will the knowledge be used to enhance health, life, reduce illness or disability? And again, this may be one of the first things that reviewers read, or program people or other people. They might read this first because it's very short. It just gives you a quick idea of what this whole thing's about. And this will also become public if it's funded, so it should be understandable for a lay audience. And again, like the abstract, I wouldn't use any proprietary or confidential information that you don't want out there. On to the bio sketches. So the first thing you need to be aware of is that these forms change very frequently. and you need to make sure you're using the most updated forms. So always search to find out what form version that NIH is on for a particular target proposal date, because you may find yourself transposing a form you've already used onto a new form, which is frustrating. Especially if you're asking for biosketches from somebody and they send it to you on the old version, and then you have to transform it or somebody else has to. So, what I usually do when I request a biosketch from somebody is I will send them the most recent form version and say, can you, put your biosketch on this recent form version if you don't already have it on that form version. So that's a good practice, I guess. So this document should showcase the scientific contributions across your career. And really, you should hone this document to the proposal that you're writing. So you can describe up to five of your most significant contributions, but you really want them to be related as much as possible to the proposal that you're writing, and not, kind of off on some other tangent, unless you don't have like a critical mass of contributions as a young investigator, right? You might put those other ones in there, but you really want to kind of have everything relevant. There's a limit of 5 pages. And when I was preparing this talk, Maggie helped me with the slides, and I wasn't aware that we have there's actually a tool, SciNCV, that can help you prepare an NIH biosketch. And I just watched the video tutorial a few minutes ago, and it looks pretty neat. Check out that video tutorial and just see if it could be useful to you. I will say that old dogs hate new tricks. I have biosketches from the past that I just pull up and edit. So, but if you don't have a biosketch, this is probably a great way to start. It can bring in your bibliographies from like PubMed right into your document. There's a lot of time-saving tools. It looks like that tool can help you with. So I would encourage you to utilize it. The personal statement of your biosketch, it's kind of the first part after your list of education and awards and all that stuff. So why are you well suited for this role in the project? So it really needs to be specific to this project. What are you going to do, and why are you the person to do it? You could include up to 4 peer-reviewed publications for this section, specifically highlighting your experience and qualifications for this project. And I want to highlight this project, right? Beware of, so what I usually do when I ask for these is, I'll highlight or put in what I want, or what I think the role of this, my collaborator is going to be. I type in a few sentences in that section and have them elaborate on that, and add in more stuff relative to their experience. And, I put in like my view of why I chose them to be a co-investigator, and then they can elaborate on that. So whenever you can on these documents, if you're asking somebody to do something for you, like fill out a biosketch, steer them, help them. I think that's really much appreciated. Give them all the help they can to help you. Don't just say, I need your biosketch. Well, what's the project? How am I going to be involved? What do you want me to say? If you don't be specific, they're just going to give you their last biosketch, pretty much. And then you've got to go back to them and say, well, that's, can I edit this? You can also put in impediments to past productivity if you feel there's a hole in your vita, or a year or two where you might have not had the productivity that you think might be necessary. You can explain that there. So that's a nice feature. There's a place where you can put your positions and honors. Chronological list of your positions, postdoc, first year assistant professor, whatever. Your society affiliation, your memberships, your editorships, whether you're a reviewer for NIH or other places, your list of honors and awards received, which is nice. So then comes the contribution to science section. So this is where you can describe up to 5 of your most significant contributions to science. Again, it needs to be fairly concise, and I would recommend not using more than a half a page or so for each contribution. So it needs to be concise. Usually what I do is I number it, and I bold it, and I I underline it, this is one contribution, and then I have a little narrative, and then I list up to 4 peer-reviewed publications after that the narrative speaks about. Research products, publications. I guess if you're in other fields, you could have patents and databases and things like that. And you can URL to your full list of publications, which is nice. So you could have as many as 5 of those, but no more than 5. And I would suggest that, anything, conciseness is better than long-windedness when it comes to writing proposals, because reviewers appreciate that. If they're having to look through this long bio sketch and all these contributions, again, if you got them, flaunt them. If they're related to the proposal, if they're not related, consider not including them and just including the ones that are related to the proposal. And then at the end, you have to list your research support. So this is your list of all ongoing research support that you have, funded research, but also your recently completed support within the past 3 years. So if something ended 2 years ago, you could list that as completed, but within the last 3 years. For all the funded research, your ongoing support, you need to explain in this section if it overlaps at all with what you're requesting in this proposal. So if there's no overlap, so state there's no overlap with this proposal. But you do have to explain a little bit, in a sentence or so or two about, what that ongoing research is about. And if there's overlap, also state that. But then you might add a sentence about how this proposal, the one you're submitting, is going to extend it or improve, or add to it. You should begin with the projects most relevant to the proposal, and then indicate again, in 1 or 2 sentences, the goals of the project and your role. Usually, you just do that by, saying whether you're a principal investigator on the project, a co-investigator. You can put the effort down too, how many calendar months or whatever that you've got on that particular project. Okay, on to letters of support. So
Hey, Jeff, we have a question in the chat.
sure.
Can we back up for a second? If you're a young investigator, is it okay if you have fewer contributions listed in your bio sketch? Which I would say, yeah, that's understandable.
Yeah, by nature of the fact that you haven't been in the game very long, you're going to have fewer overall contributions. So, yeah, I mean, you may only have 1 contribution to science, right? If it's related, to, but hopefully it's related to this proposal that you're writing, right? If it's not, then, then that could be perceived as a weakness by the reviewers. So, yeah, it's okay to have 1, 2, if you can kind of split up, into, a couple, that'd be good.
Another question about the overlap of proposals. I think that, like, for instance, people shouldn't be in the habit of having an extremely generic proposal title and using that same title multiple times. Then it does get, on the face of it, kind of confusing that you're trying to get, different sources of money for like the same thing. So it is important to try to have a specific, as you will see, specific aims and delineate the different projects you're working on, so you can explain this clearly to people. So in that sense, professors have to be much more managers than they used to be years ago.
Yeah, so in that, bio sketch, you do have to list the title of the proposal, but then you also have a couple sentences to explain what it's about too. So if it is a generic, the effect of X on Y, you can explain more about the proposal in those couple sentences. But I agree with you, Patty. A descriptive title is always a better title, I think, than a general for a proposal. Any other questions in the chat that we could hit right now, or is that about it?
That's it.
Okay, let's move on. So letters of support. Again, these letters, you got to think about what the purpose of the letter is, or the goal of the letter if you're a reviewer. Does it demonstrate that the necessary equipment and support is available and accessible? So that's something. So if you need something at a core facility or something in a colleague's lab that you don't have, are you going to be able to access it? And how often are you going to be able to access it? Are there going to be any throughput problems with getting data from that piece of equipment? Who should provide letters? Well, they could be your collaborators, even if they're key investigators or key personnel on your grant. I always err on the side of including more letters than including fewer letters, because I've seen NIH reviewers, criticize, well, they didn't provide a letter of support. I've never seen one say, oh, he has too many letters of support, right? You know, if you can err on that side, I think you'll be all right. So who should provide a letter? Collaborators, consultants, your department head. You know, maybe you want to highlight your institutional support, like when you were hired, how much lab space you've been given, what your startup package was, you know, what your mentorship, you know, looks like in your department, what kind of infrastructure you have. That's certainly something you can ask of your department head. But again, what I would do is draft the letter for your department head and then have he or she edit it and add, you know, different aspects to it. What should be in the letter? Well, you could have expectations for co-authorship, certainly what their role might be in the project, what resources might be provided to you if you're needing resources from somebody else. If you're going to core facilities, what resources are there, and is access free, or is it fee for service, or, you know, what's the likelihood of you getting in there and being able to do your work in the project period. So those are all just some, you know, some ideas of things that could go in letters, who should write the letters. Like I mentioned, you know, you might need a letter to show institutional commitment. You might need a letter to show collaboration. You might need a letter to show consultation. And again, it's very important for junior investigators. If there's any doubt, it doesn't hurt to have your co-Is and anybody else provide letters of support for your proposal. Everybody, you know, that just shows that everybody's aware of your proposal. They're there to support you in whatever way is mentioned. And it's a good thing, I think.
So yeah, at Beckman, I do a lot of letters of support. Oh, I guess you're going to get into that. But one thing that I wanted to tell people is that there's no such thing as a free lunch. So sometimes people will ask me, oh, I'm going to do this cool study, and can I get free time on this microscope or this, the MRI scanner or whatever at Beckman? And the answer is that what we would have to do is we would have to say, we will pay for you to have this access. There's no such thing as just making something free. So if you're not paying for it from a grant, then Beckman's paying for it from its overhead. So if we're going to do that, we have to actually plan for it. So again, as Jeff said earlier, you got to ask us early if that's the sort of thing that's going to be important to you. But we're always wonderfully happy to have your grant fund our self-supporting facilities. So as you can certainly put that in your direct budget to use instruments, obviously, too.
Absolutely. And it's always surprising. People are always surprised when I tell them this, but even at the F&A rate of 58.6%, which is what our university charges, we do not recoup all of the money that we spend on the research enterprise. So, you know, we are spending money to do research, and it's not all recouped from indirect costs associated with research grants. So if you're writing research grants with 0% indirect costs, you know, people do get a little frustrated with that if you're not moving towards getting grants with full ICR to help support the cost of the research. So going back to the letters of support, again, best practices, as I mentioned, provide your collaborator, mentor, or your resource with a draft of the letter. You know, what are you looking for out of them? Make sure that you request that they put it on the most appropriate letterhead. Some people you may ask have multiple titles in multiple places, so you might want them, you know, at one and not the other. Request it in the appropriate format. A lot of times they'll send it to you in a protected PDF. Sometimes that doesn't work for you. Give them enough information about the project and specifically their role. So if you want them involved in it, you certainly have to have a talk, preferably before you ask them for the letter, about how they're going to fit into this project. And then make sure you give enough time to edit and sign it. So, you know, turning it around in 48 hours probably is a little too quick. You probably want it a couple weeks ahead of time. That's why I say anything that you're asking another person to do that kind of early in your proposal development scheme, so that you give them enough time to do it. And then, you know, do you need a biosketch in addition to the letter? You could ask at the same time. And it's always very good, especially if they're a key personnel or they got effort on your grant or you're asking to do something, is to have a very frank conversation with your collaborator about what their role is. If the budget, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, if the budget's going to be broken up between your lab and one of your collaborators, how is that going to look? How much is going to them? What are you asking them to do? So all that's really, really important to have to talk about before you submit the proposal, because there could be, bad things happen if you, submit the proposal, get the funding, and then all of a sudden, there's a disagreement about, how things are going to go down, especially when there's money involved, right? And I know it's a lot of times it's hard for a junior investigator to go to a senior investigator and to have these conversations about budget and asking them, oh, I need you to do this. Can you do it for this? Or and if there's a disagreement on the amount, then that's a difficult situation. So you need to be open-minded. You need to have these frank conversations with your collaborators ahead of time, so that you can get the work done. I mean, at the end of the day, it's about getting the work done. Maggie added this slide in. I'm a little bit less familiar with advocacy, but I do know that the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, which is born out of the Affordable Care Act, kind of changed the way in which some science is done and began to involve patients a lot more in terms of them being not just subjects in research studies, but part of the research process. I guess that could be called an advocate or advocacy. And so in some grants, especially like the PCORI grants, the Patient-Centered Outcome Research grants, or sometimes foundation grants, or in some instances, some NIH mainstream grants, you might need an advocate, which would be, for patients with patients, right? How are you going to, include patients in your research, and what is their role? So there's some hyperlinks here and some other things that you can kind of look at. We do have a cancer research advocacy group through the Cancer Center, I think. So you could access that group if you're doing cancer research. If you're doing research on MS, we have a MS Research Collaborative. If you're doing research with veterans, we have a collaborative on campus. But you also may be able to hook up with, local American Heart Association groups or others to be able to speak to advocacy if it's required in your grant proposal, because you're going to get reviewed on it. You definitely need to do that. And so, you use your resources and your network to find out how you can do that. Maggie, do you have anything to add on that?
No, I think you covered it. I think this is much less common in NIH grants. As you said, it's more for those kind of research dissemination type things like PCORI.
Yeah.
But yeah, if you have a study where you might need some patient support, this is a good way to find it.
A cover letter. So this would be kind of the initial letter that maybe the program officer would look at right at the beginning. Not all applications need these. I usually include one as kind of an attachment cover letter. This really is kind of being replaced by the assignment request form, but it used to be where the cover letter was where you stated the title of your grant, the years that it would cover, and then you'd request where you want it to be reviewed, which NIH review group and which institute. But with this new assignment form, you don't necessarily have to have this unless you wanted to, I guess. I guess it's optional. So it may be needed for specific RFAs. If the submission is late for some reason, I know a lot of times if there's weather-related acts of God, you might want a cover letter on that. NIH usually tells you if, because of hurricane, whatever, we've delayed the submission deadline on this one. Or if there's a correction that you could maybe make post after the deadline, although that's really frowned upon a lot. Yeah, so. Also if your direct costs go over $500,000 a year. But I would say that, cover letter is not the time to identify that. It's really to talk to your program officer before you even submit the proposal, because you have to get special permission if in any one year your NIH budget goes above $500,000 in direct research costs. So you definitely need program officer approval. I will say that I just had this conversation with a program officer last month, and she said that we're funding those large proposals at about 5% relative to proposals that come in under $500,000 in direct research costs. So, you know, try to keep your costs reasonable or make your project smaller because it's hard to get, you know, especially as a junior investigator, it's hard to get, you know, significant, you know, large budgets. So just word to the wise. I've never used this tool, but here's the assignment request form that you can go to. Yeah, so I think I usually have somebody help me with this, but this is where you can put in the RFA number, the title, and then you can put in the specific where you want it to go. The study section, actually the probably the institute, yeah, institute here, and then study section down here. So if you're not familiar with the term study section, then these are the review groups, the IRGs, the initial review groups. So you can go to NIH's website, probably the Center for Scientific Review, and do a search of all the standing study sections, and try to pick a 1 or 2 or even 3, because they give you 3 choices here, where your work might fit in terms of who's going to review it. You can also look up the roster, the current roster and the past rosters. So that's usually a good way to find out, you know your people in your field. Are any of them reviewers on this grant, on this particular study section or review group? Yeah, so it is, is that, do you talk about that in another session, Maggie?
Yeah, we covered it in the peer review week.
Okay. Yeah, so I won't spend any time on that. So maybe now I'll just take a quick break, and if there's anything in the chat box, maybe we can read it and discuss it, or if anybody has any questions. Maggie, you have override on? How do you want to do it?
If anyone has questions, they can either put them in the chat box or unmute and ask them.
Okay. So we'll.
It's up to them. I don't see any, but I had a question about the biosketches because I was talking to someone about this recently. So in the personal statement, you can put impediments to past productivity, whether that's a family responsibility or military service or something like that. I was wondering, Jeff, have you ever seen people actually include this? And would you advise to include this, or is this something that maybe you don't necessarily want to talk about?
Yeah, you know, I can't remember seeing, I mean, I haven't seen something like that. I think maybe once I saw something like that, because it took a long time for somebody's lab to get set up. So they put in a statement, and actually in the letter of support from the department head put in something to that effect as well. So not only was the PI telling the reviewers that they had a problem getting started, the department head also said that for some, you know, extenuating circumstance. So I have seen it, but it's rare. So only do it if, you know, get some advice about whether what you perceive as a hole in your resume or productivity, somebody else sees that too, before you go ahead and start doing that stuff. Yeah. I guess another way you could do it is, you know, you've got an outstanding productivity record, but then you could go in there and say, well, I just haven't been as productive. People will be like, wow, this person could be more. Right.
I'm not sure you'd want to do that.
No, you wouldn't.
Okay. All right. If we don't have
Any
any
other
more
questions
questions, we
before we
can
move
move
on?
on.
All right. What are we doing on time, Maggie?
Got about 45 minutes.
Okay, good. So care and use of animals. So I'll go fairly quickly through this section. So, you know, there's some nice hyperlinks here about, you know, what you need to know with respect to the use of vertebrate animals. And then there's a worksheet as well that you can do. Your protocol must be reviewed by IACUC, but you don't need to do it before you receive the award. So at the proposal stage, you can just put in the necessary information for NIH about, you know, our assurance number, and that it will be reviewed, TBD, you know, once the project is done. But I will say, as soon as you find out about whether or not you're going to get an award, I would start that process of filling out your IACUC protocol and getting that submitted, so that you don't get too far behind the 8 ball once you get the money so that you can do the work. Because it does take IACUC probably, 4 to 8 weeks to review your protocol and get you an approval. So, sometimes it's got to go back and forth a little bit. So, make sure you do that ahead of time. And, most of the things that you need in this form on the NIH proposal, you have to put in your IACUC protocol anyways. So, project description, justification for use of animals in the species, consideration from alternatives, what procedures you're going to be doing on the animals. You don't probably have to go into as much gory detail for the proposal as you do for the IACUC protocol, but you do need to give that some thought and put that in there. And once you have to fill out the IACUC protocol, you can go back to your NIH grant and pull those sections from this document and start your IACUC protocol that way. So no good work goes unwasted, right? So this just goes through the sections: description of procedures, the justifications. Here's a little hyperlink to how to write an application involving research animals, so I won't spend too much time on that. Minimizing pain and distress, certainly need to talk about that. Method of euthanasia, need to talk about that. So then on to human subjects research. So this is research involving a living individual about whom an investigator obtains either data through intervention, interaction with the individual, or identifiable private information. There's a nice infographic there you can look at. There's another hyperlink, requirements and resources for human subjects research. There's various tools. There's decision trees that you can use. So all these things are important, and you should use them as resources. IRB approval, just like IACUC approval, is needed if the grant's awarded. So you don't need this ahead of time, but if you get funded, you will need it. And so you do have to provide NIH with some information up front. Some of these forms, if you look at them, you'll figure it out pretty quick. So just here's some of the information that's included in these forms. Protection of human subjects. There's a data. There may or may not be a requirement for a data safety monitoring plan. So it's really important to, again, read your RFA and understand what's in these sections what's important, because sometimes they'll say, oh, you need a data safety monitoring plan for this grant. And if you don't read the RFA and it's 2 days before the grant proposal and you got to do a data safety monitoring plan, that hurts, because usually you're working really hard on your research strategy right up to the last second. And if you got to stop and break and do a DSMP, then your grant's not going to be as good as it could be. At least I think. Just some more stuff on human subject section. So it's important to have to talk about inclusion of individuals across the lifespan, as well as inclusion of women and minorities. And I know, Maggie, you did a little bit of research on that and found out that they broke this section up a little bit. Do you have anything you want to add to this?
Yeah, no, it's just that they used to have, it was inclusion of women, minorities, and children. It was all in one section that you would talk about that. And now they have it split into two. So inclusion of individuals across the lifespan. So that could include children as well as older adults. And then inclusion of women and minorities specifically. Yep. And that's new for this year. Since May, I think the policy was put in with the new Forms F.
Thanks. So also importantly here, in your research strategy, you're certainly going to have to talk about recruitment and retention of human subjects in your research. But you can provide a lot more detail here, right? So you can put the basic important points in your research strategy, but then provide all the other details here in this human subject section. Same thing with the study timeline. You need to speak to the study timeline in the research strategy, but maybe only briefly. And then you can refer to this other document for the details on the study timeline. So this is where these forms really help you convey some more information, at least the details of that information, so that people can understand it better. There's some tables that you have to fill out in human subjects. Basically, how are you deciding on on how many and which ethnic categories are really important for your research? It's important to have a diverse research pool. Usually in studies that I've done that, in Champaign County, I kind of fall back on the census data as to, what is the makeup of our local community catchment area in terms of these ethnic and racial categories and groups. And then I basically, if I need 200 people, I'll multiply, the different percentages of the ethnic categories and racial categories by how many people I need. And that's how you come up with the number of, these different categories. So you need to make sure you represent all the groups. Unless there's, if you're doing only research on males because you're studying prostate cancer, then, that makes sense. Yeah, that's really important to do that. Another question you have to address is whether your project is a clinical trial. Be very careful when you're reading the RFAs because they'll say clinical trials only or not clinical trials. So, if you're looking at an RFA, you need to know whether it's a clinical trial, well, whether they will allow a clinical trial or whether they mandate a clinical trial or whether they don't mandate a clinical trial. So you need to know the definition of a clinical trial, and that's a research study in which one or more human subjects are prospectively assigned to one or more interventions to evaluate the effects of those interventions on health-related biomedical or behavioral outcomes. And you can kind of use that hyperlink to kind of see the definition. They actually have decision trees and things, but really it comes down to 4 questions. Is your study a clinical trial? Well, does the study involve human participants? I would imagine yes, if you're doing a human's work. Are the participants prospectively assigned to an intervention? So are they randomized to different groups? That's an important characteristic. If the answer is yes, you move on. Is the study designed to evaluate the effects of the intervention on the participants? Yes, probably. Is the effect being evaluated health-related or biomedical or behavioral outcomes? Yes. So if you answer yes to all 4 of these, it's a clinical trial. If you answer no to 1 or more, it's not. And so, yeah, they have tools that you can use to kind of go through this, but that's basically kind of the summation. If it is a clinical trial, that pulls into more complexity. There's other forms you have to fill out. And so be mindful of that when you're doing this, that there's other review criteria. I remember I submitted one a few years ago and it seemed like I almost had a whole other proposal I had to write, although it's probably not that bad. This one was a special one, but I had to write a huge document about, it was a huge ancillary document in addition to the research strategy for this particular proposal. So again, that's where you're reading the RFA of the proposal you're wishing to submit is really valuable. And knowing, kind of creating a checklist for yourself up front before you even start. What forms do I need? Whose help do I need? And that can help organize you. I know, at least in our unit, our grant specialist helps the PI form make a checklist, which is good. So they work together, and our grant specialist, makes the checklist and then sends that to the investigator. Not all units have equal resources for grant proposal development, however. Some units on campus have very little support. Other units have good support. So really it's about your local environment and what kind of research support is available to you. Talk to your mentor, talk to your senior investigators, your department head about that.
And I think that Go link to the clinical trials, I think that's the training that we did a couple of years ago, Maggie. So that's where several of us got together and went through a bunch of use cases about, is this a clinical trial or not? And then I think I shared at that time that I have been a person who got permission from U of I to be a person to register a clinical trial. So I have gone through this a couple of times, and I got to say that registering your study as a clinical trial is really tedious. So it's not that you just upload a PDF document explaining it. Like, you have to go through all the NIH web forms, and even if you don't think about your study as having arms with all these different variables, you have to go through and do all this stuff. And I for a long time, one of my inputs was rejected by a reviewer that I wasn't explaining it properly. And I'm like, they only get this part of the intervention if this other condition happens, and there's no way to say that in their website. So that can be frustrating. So just a heads up, in some ways it's nice to avoid having a clinical trial, because if you have to go through clinical trials together, that's going to take somebody hours to do that.
Yeah, that's an important decision. If you can avoid it and still do what you want, then, by all means.
Yeah, and you
But
did
with
to
that
maintain
generous,
it.
but with a generous definition of what is a clinical trial, a
Yeah.
lot of things will be clinical trials. So it's not just hundreds of people in a drug trial anymore. It's really a pretty broad definition.
Yeah, we had that situation in the grant I submitted where it was a clinical trial, but we were an ancillary study to the clinical trial. So all we were doing was collecting biospecimens from people, but we weren't doing the randomization and we weren't doing this. So one of the questions we could answer no to, and that knocked us out of being a clinical trial. So I was like, whew, you know.
There was a question that just went into chat. If I have met the first 3 points for a clinical trial, but the outcome is behavioral, but not health-related behavior, is it a clinical trial?
Well, my question back to you is, if it's not health related, why are you submitting to NIH, right? I mean, it should be, if it's NIH, it's health related. If it's not health related, then maybe you're submitting to what, NSF or somewhere else? I don't know if you want to unmute.
It's recruitment for All of Us, for an All of Us research project. So it's for
Oh.
the precision medicine.
Yeah. I don't know. At the end of the day, if you're confused about something and reading the RFA doesn't help you, it's best to talk to a program person, to give them shoot them an email and ask them. So that would be my recommendation.
Yeah, also if you go to that link that was on the previous slide or two about Go Illinois/clinical trials, we had I don't have it right in front of me, but I think we had an example of somebody saying the intervention was looking at advertising, and the behavioral question was something like, do people feel persuaded or whatever? So I just don't remember what the details were. So we might have a pretty good use case there. So Steve and I would check that out. And then you can always email us if you have questions too.
Very
So
good.
yeah, so I'm betting it probably is a clinical trial, especially if it's related to all of us.
Yeah, probably. Before we move on, we did have another question I think is relevant to a lot of people. Is there any benefit to already having your IACUC or possibly your IRB approved before you submit? They specifically
Well,
asked
it just
IACUC.
shows that you're working on a project that's very similar or exactly the same. I mean, you're obviously being able to generate preliminary data. I think from a reviewer standpoint, probably not. I don't think reviewers look closely whether you've got a current IACUC protocol for this project. But everybody knows that, if you get the award, you need to have an IACUC protocol for this project.
Yeah, so I think most people, when they apply for a grant, they're just going to check pending IACUC approval or pending IRB approval. But if you actually already have a protocol and you've, using your startup package or something to get going on it now, I think it's good to be hitting the ground running. And so when you get your award, boom, you're ready to go instead of having to wait to get that approval. But I also agree with Jeff that I don't think that reviewers are going to see, oh, you've already got that done. That's not going to be a big decision maker for the reviewers, I don't think. But it certainly, I think, is convenient and efficient.
Absolutely.
We got a question here about children. Is it necessary to address inclusion of children across the lifespan? So I don't remember. So haven't done this this NIH formula you're referring to about inclusion of other people, but I do know from an IRB perspective that if you're going to have children in your study, that's like a whole bunch of extra stuff. So you wouldn't just, throw children in your study for no reason. If you've got a real reason to do it, then you would be doing it.
Right. So one thing you may do, I mean, especially, it's probably good practice for any research study with human subjects, is to, if you have an approved informed consent form or a draft of the informed consent form, to have that as an ancillary document for your proposal. Particularly with children, it refers to, you have to refer to things like assent and consent, and, the parents consenting for the child, and all that stuff. So I'm not, I haven't done research with children, but I do know there's many on this campus that do that, and there's certainly special requirements, as Patty mentioned, from the IACUC and from NIH to do work with kids. So facilities and resources page. So this really addresses the research environment. How does that going to contribute to success? So that's, again, one of the 5 review criteria for NIH. So this is where you can describe your lab space, your facilities, your scientific environment, your institutional commitment, anything in the environment. It doesn't have to be just the physical environment. I think everybody kind of falls back and just starts describing their lab and I've got, 5 computers and this and that. It's other things as well. I mean, it could be, your mentoring environment. Who's helping you? What's your mentoring situation look like? Do you have a senior investigator that mentors you? How supportive is your department head? All that stuff you can put in your scientific environment. A lot of times you're using core facilities on campus, and the core facilities have, good text that you can take that describes, all of their facilities. So, take advantage of the work that they've done. What I would recommend you not doing is just putting taking their web page and putting it onto the form. You really want to be specific. So, if you're using the Functional Genomics Center at the Carver Biotech and you're not using the DNA sequencing, speak to the Functional Genomics Center and not to all these other resources. So, don't just slap stuff up there to try to wow people. Really show them the capabilities that are related to the research project you're proposing. And then also having a letter of support from, the director of that core, stating, yeah, I've worked with Jeff before, and, we've done this, and, we're going to be able to help him here and this, so, that's really important, I think.
Yeah, this is something that we do at Beckman all the time. And so I'm the person that often writes these letters or these paragraphs about our facilities. And so, yeah, I would customize it to whatever you're doing, which kind of microscope or MRI scanner or other visualization workflow. And we would want to help you explain, how we're going to help you do the project. Also, I always like to remember that U of I has a fantastic library system. So that's another part of the infrastructure being at a great university is we have a wonderful library, and that is usually worth a sentence in many cases too.
Yeah, a lot of times, like I was going to pull up an example of one I'm working on right now, actually. But I put pictures in the facilities. Show them the lab, show them a picture of a piece of equipment. Going to the last point on this slide, what resources are being provided by other sites. So if you've got a collaborator in another institution, you need to also include them in your facilities and other resources to make sure that that's covered. So that along with a letter of support. So.
We have a question in the chat about facilities page or equipment page. And my answer was, oh, there we go. We're going to talk about equipment now.
Yeah.
So okay, let's get to that and then we can maybe.
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know if these are 2 separate pages, but certainly it's facilities and other resources. So, you can put the equipment that you have on here. You could state that you can state when you purchased it, whether there's a service contract on it. Sometimes you want to cover the cost of a service contract. So that might be a line item in your budget to help cover the cost of maintaining that equipment, which is necessary for the work you're doing. Usually you're only talking about major equipment. I mean, you don't have to picture here of beakers, or Erlenmeyer flasks. You don't have to talk about how many Erlenmeyer flasks you have. It's really just major equipment that is necessary to do the work. And also accessibility. How often are you going to need it? And do any other investigators use it? And will that cut into your time or not? So you need, people need some assurances for that. And you can include equipment in your grant if you need it, and it's not available elsewhere, or if it's available elsewhere, but it's used so frequently that it's going to be not viable for your use. You can include equipment in the proposal.
Oh, we have a couple of questions. Okay, so getting back to Annette's question about key equipment, the way that I usually interpret these distinctions is that if you're going to use like a microscope in a core facility or the functional genomics machine at the IGB, for example, that's like a facility. So that's equipment that's part of a core facility. But I usually think of this equipment as like the stuff in your lab that's just like for you. So therefore, nobody else is necessarily going to know about it. So you got to explain that here. But, the fact that IGB's course has this or Beckman course have that, that's like more of a facility thing, even though it's obviously equipment that you're going to use.
Right. Good point. Any other questions?
We have another question about children. So I think, so Mary asks about, will a reviewer look negatively at not including children? I personally don't think that unless the actual RFA says they literally want people to understand the entire developmental lifespan from age 0 to 100 or whatever. if the RFA doesn't say that, then I generally, as I used to chair the IRB, and we would almost always just see adults. I mean, like, so I would say my default research strategy would be to look at adults, unless there is a specific reason that you need to look at children to assess their development in some way.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I feel like there's usually more that you have to explain to justify using children in a study as opposed to adults, since children can't consent for themselves. They have to have an adult to consent for them.
Yeah, so I would take what we said earlier about the lifespan as general. So for instance, I think that NIH does not want us to discriminate against older people or against minorities and that kind of stuff. So you want to be open to having a very broad population of people in your study. But I think that we generally use that to mean age 18 and up, that adults.
So, you know, taking stock of your resources, so relative to equipment, you can kind of take a look at these questions, list of questions here. So you should, you know, look at these questions to see, you know, in your situation with your proposal, you know, what are you going to do? How are you going to address these things? Do you need to purchase equipment on grant? You know, how much is that equipment? If the equipment's too expensive to be able to put on the grant, and you know, you won't be able to do the work because you're buying the equipment, then you're going to have to figure out some other way to get that equipment purchased, either another grant or, you know, whatever. But you know, if you need it to do the work, then that's important. And you know, luckily at Illinois, we're a huge research institution. We've got wonderful core facilities all across campus that are available to PIs that can be used for research purposes. So don't forget about biostatistics. That's part of the environment. If you're doing NIH work, it's more times than not, you're going to have a biostatistician review your research proposal. And it can become frustrating when they make comments about it, but you should make sure that your statistical approach section is very sound. And if your budget can afford it, have a biostatistician on your grant. I think that goes a long way in alleviating concerns of reviewers who are biostatisticians. So again, if you can afford it, at least some effort, maybe at the latter part of the grant when you've generated the data, to have a biostatistician help you with the analysis. So I think that's very important. Same thing for clinical support. NIH, this is, you know, I guess relatively new in the last 15 or 20 years, a resource sharing plan. This ensures that the applicant has developed a plan to share final research data. The data could share model organisms that will be developed, to share large-scale genomic data sets that will be generated. And usually this consists of 3 components: of the data sharing plan, sharing model organisms, the genomic data sharing. All or some may apply to your research. So this is another section that you have to do and think about. For the data sharing plan, certainly expected if you're seeking direct research costs above $500K in any one year. Many of us don't do that. And so really you got to look in the FOA or the RFA to know what's expected in that, whether this is expected as part of the proposal or not. I would always err on the side of including it if it's not clear, or contacting the program officer to find out exactly what's necessary for this particular proposal. We do have an entity at our university called the Illinois Research Data Service. Heidi Imker is the director, and in past seminars we've had her at this session. She wasn't able to be here this time. But this is a campus-wide resource to provide expertise, tools, and infrastructure necessary to manage and steward your data. So they have up-to-date knowledge on agency policies regarding research data management and sharing. So they're the experts. You can go to them. They actually have a tool called the DMP tool, the Data Management Planning Tool. I've used this. It's nice. You click on the link, you enter some information, and it generates a form which then staff at the Illinois Research Data Service look at and help you develop your documents, your data sharing documents. So it's a good tool. And again, as with any resource, the earlier you contact them, the better.
Another point about this is if you're doing a human study and you intend to share de-identified aggregate human data after you're done collecting your data, this has to be in your informed consent document. And in fact, in the study that I'm working on now for the 7T MRI at Carl, we've discussed, the point of our first study is to create a database that will be published on the openneuro.org website. And therefore, our sort of philosophical discussion was, is data sharing actually an inclusion criteria, that if you refuse to share your data, you shouldn't even be in the study? So that's what I'm navigating now, because Carl's IRB assumes that data sharing is an option for you. And if you don't want to do it, you can still be in the study. And we're like, actually, for this one, we would say, if you don't want to share your data, we don't mind you. We want to be able to publish all of our brains and all the stuff that goes with it. So remember to do that if you're going to have people. So data sharing has to be part of your informed consent process and all your IRB stuff too.
Right. So I've got one other that jogs my memory to something else here. So Maggie and Patty, I know we've gone to REDCap just in the last couple of years for privacy for data sharing. So is there language or text that is available for researchers to include in their documents relative to our REDCap capabilities?
I believe there is. I would have to find out. I know our REDCap site or page on our website, the IHSI site, is very detailed, and there's a lot of information up there. And if it's not up there, you can always contact Michelle Lohr, who's our REDCap specialist.
Yeah, I'm using Carl's IRB format because I'm doing my IRB through Carl for this study, because the 7T magnet is at Carl, and they have language that you stick into your protocol and your informed consent document for REDCap.
Right.
So, of course, but I'm using the U of I REDCAP, so hopefully I will not run into a problem. I guess I'll find out the hard way.
So I guess bottom line for everybody out there is that if you're going to collect data that needs to be private, you're going to use REDCap, and then you probably need to put some information in the proposal about our REDCap capabilities on campus. And so then I would, talk to somebody at IHSI and then, find out what text you might need or what they can provide.
Yeah, and actually, I was just talking to the guy that Carl just hired to be the director of their imaging center, and he is a huge fan of having a shared human subject registry, where what if all hundreds of investigators who were doing human studies, if we all used REDCap and we all had the same kind of basic background question, and we all had the same shared database to coordinate across studies, that could be really useful. And at Beckman, we already have this thing called iHelp, which is just the investigators who study cognitive aging are getting together and making their own little database, but we're talking now about generalizing this to me even more broad. So REDCap is obviously going to be really helpful the more we move into that direction too.
Yeah, it has a lot of capabilities that probably we underutilize because it's new on our campus and we don't understand all of its strengths. So here's just a slide on sharing of model organisms if you're creating things, genomic data sharing. So there's some hyperlinks here, and I know we're getting kind of short on time, and I really want to get the budget. So let me blow through this, and then we'll talk about the budget, and then we'll have time at the end for questions because it's 4:43 now. So in budgets, so if you can do all of the work in your lab or on our campus, that's an easier budget than if you are working with an external entity that's helping you with something, and we have to give them some money out of this proposal that you're writing. That's called a subaward. So you're subawarding money to another external partner that is doing something for you. So this performs some activity that maybe you don't have the capability to do here at Illinois or in your lab. And this requires an agreement between the U of I and the subawardee's institution. So you need to work with locally the person in your unit who works with grant budgets, but ultimately with SPA, the Sponsored Programs Administration Office on campus, to develop the subcontract. So basically what you're doing is you're asking your collaborator to provide you with some information that then can be approved by SPA. And it also has to be approved by their sponsored research office. So as you might imagine, this could take some time, and you want to try to initiate this process early. So you are accountable, not the sub-awardee, to NIH for any performance decrements associated with the proposal. So you want to make sure that this goes down right from the get-go, and that your collaborator understands the nature of the sub-award, is comfortable with the budget that you're giving, and that you're both very comfortable with what that person is going to be doing. And so usually what has to happen is that they have to provide you with a statement of work. So exactly what are you going to be doing for them? And then you're going to need to discuss your budget with that collaborator. And then you're going to have to develop the budget and then get it approved. I think there's another form that the sponsor programs offices need to fill out, an intent I forget what it is, but there's form. Let me put it this way. There's forms, and it's going to take some time. So if you're doing a sub-award, you need to get on it early. And people need to help you with this. And so, again, you need to get it moving quicker. Again, the important place to go initially is the RFA, to understand what the cap is on any budget and what costs are allowed or not allowed. So you certainly want to read the RFA before you start with your budget. You probably want to have anybody who's helping with you read the RFA as well, so that they can help and help you understand. If you have any questions about the RFA and related to budget, you can always contact the program officer to get a clarification. You need to think about the budget while you're writing your research plan or your research strategy. How much will the experiments cost? You don't want to come off naive and propose too much work and too big of a budget. On the other hand, you don't want to be underfunded to do your work. So you really need to do the legwork to understand the costs associated with the work you're doing. Most costs are caught up in personnel. So you're going to take some effort. Your collaborators might need effort. You might need a graduate research assistant. You might need a postdoc. All that's going to cost. And not only their salary, but it's also going to cost you the fringe. So you may have seen there's been a lot of communication recently about fringe benefits and about that because the state had surprised us on something. But you need to know what that is. And right now, I think the newest one, don't quote me on this, I think it's 46.91%. So if you're putting yourself in for $10,000 of salary in the first year, multiply 10,000 by 46.91%, and that's going to be the fringe. And that comes out of the direct research costs. So, make sure you understand that when you're building your budget. What I always do is I start on my budget right away. I mean, once you have the idea and you write your specific aims page, and you kind of start to think about your experimental plan and how many subjects you're going to need, how many animals you're going to need, you can kind of start line iteming all of your expenses, and then start doing the calculations to calculate. I know, in the grant I'm writing today, I was talking to Lucas Lee at the Metabolomics Center to get a per sample cost for untargeted LCMS. $76 a sample. Okay, how many samples am I running? 400 samples. Okay, there's one item. Boom. Next item. On to the next one. So, it does take some time to do that. So you need to start early. Start early. Don't wait till the last minute. Contact your business office. We usually recommend our investigators contact about 4 weeks ahead of time. So in our unit, we've got a intent to submit a proposal form that investigators fill out. It's about a one-page thing, the RFA link, the title, whether there's cost shares on it, a quick two-sentence description of what you're doing, and then, due date. And then after you fill out that form, our grant specialist will contact you, and then you can start working on the budget. So the earlier you can get going, the better. Again, identifying sub-awards, discussing your budget, at the end of the day, your department head has to sign off on your proposal. And if you're making commitments without their knowledge, you're going to get held up, right? And so, having a discussion with your department head is also wise, especially if you're taking effort and you've got a teaching load. especially if you're committing some laboratory space for your project that's shared or something. To make sure that you have these discussions ahead of time with the appropriate people who can help you is really important. So, and there's resources, templates for budget, resources at the SPA website. So, nothing gets people more up in arms than, budgets. So it's something you should start early, and make sure that you've got a good budget. You're probably aware of this, but any research project incurs both direct and indirect costs. So the direct costs are those that are identified with your particular project. So these are the costs of doing the work that you're proposing. Salaries, fringe, materials and supplies, equipment, subawards. So that's the direct costs. But also, any research project has indirect costs, or F&A, also known as facilities and administrative costs. So these are the costs that are incurred by a grantee for common or joint objectives that cannot be identified specifically within a particular project or program. So for instance, examples: utility costs for buildings, maintenance costs for buildings, general use equipment on campus. You may use the core facility. Well, some of the indirect costs go to support that core facility. So that's why we charge 58.6% of the direct total research cost as F&A, or indirect, or ICR, also known as.
Yeah, and I think that actually if you look at a bunch of other universities' F&A rates, I think that U of I is sort of in the middle. This is not like an exceptionally high or low rate, is my understanding. This is about what a lot of the big research universities are doing. And so, this is money that kind of goes to central campus and eventually filters back to cover things. But like, for example, this is why you don't have to put electricity bill in your proposal, or the time that Jeff was just spending talking with you right now. There's all these things that are supporting you that are part of this F&A. And the other thing is, therefore, the agencies know that F&A is being charged to them, and we have to validate this rate every year with a federal investigator, and our person is from the Office of Naval Research. So this is not an arbitrary number. There's a calculation involved about property costs, and utility costs, and termination benefits, and all this kind of thing. And then that also means that some costs are not allowable as direct costs. So for example, many times in a lot of proposals, you're not allowed to buy yourself a laptop computer because the assumption is the university has this indirect money and they can get you a laptop computer some other way. So you see this back and forth going on between what could be covered or should be covered with the indirect costs and what you can put in your proposal.
Yeah, and specifically, for referencing the laptop, if you were to buy a computer for a project, I believe it has to be used for that project if you're paying for it with direct costs. That was my understanding back from SPARC days.
Specifically for that project, dedicated to that project. Yep.
Yeah, that makes sense if you're doing some hardcore computational thing, but if you just want a laptop for general usage, like, no, forget it, man. Your university's supposed to give you some other money for that, and not this grant.
Allowable as direct cost.
So here's the current fringe. They just changed recently. So our Office of SPA lobbied our government to drop it a little bit because they sprung a big increase on us. But for employees covered by CSRS, it's 46.91%, and you can see how that's broken out there. There's a different rate for non-student employees, a different rate for graduate assistants, a different rate for other students. So depending on which category people fall into here, there's a different fringe rate. So you need to be aware of that. Importantly, if you are hiring a grad student as a GRA, you need to cover tuition remission. And so that is 64% of the sum of the salary for that student, their stipend, and the fringe added together. I think I got that right. So that also is a direct research cost. So a lot of times you need to think really hard about whether you want a postdoc, a GRA, or you want to hire an hourly technician. So all those things can weigh into manipulating your budget to be able to do the work that you are proposing. So deciding, what personnel you need to do the work is really important, not just from doing the work itself, but also from a budgetary standpoint. So that needs to be thought about carefully before you do the budget. NIH has two kind of budget forms: the modular budget, which is used if you're requesting less than $250,000 per year in direct research costs. There's a detailed budget if you're requesting more. It's not really onerous, the detailed budget. You have to do it anyways, really, because SPA here on campus requires you to do detailed budget anyways, so you might as well just do the detailed budget. But you can fill out the forms, for modular. It's a bit easier, and you can request in increments of $25,000. So you need to look at the RFA, and then also there's other information about modular percent detail that you can search if you're when you get to that point. In addition to actually the numbers, you need to have a justification. So this is a written document, text document that describes the major line items in your budget and why you need them. You're giving them rationale for why this cost is being requested. So for instance, effort, how much effort and why. Are there any consultants or collaborators? Is there any equipment? Is there any, what are the general research costs? What are the human subjects costs? What are the honorariums for the human subjects? So all that needs to be explained, kind of in categorical form, the way it's kind of shown here. So again, just an additional form that you have to fill out in addition to the actual numbers. Just some checkpoints for the budget there. See if there's anything I want to highlight. Again, start early. Yeah, you can read those as well as I can. There's nothing I really wanted to highlight there. I always go back and reevaluate my research plan when I've done my budget. So I'll start, I kind of work on the budget, work on the research plan, and go back and forth between the budget and research plan to match them, because you certainly want to have a good match between the amount of work you're proposing and the amount of money you're going to have to do it. And so I always go back and forth between those two documents when I'm looking at, when I'm writing my research strategy section. Absolutely.
We have a question in the chat about, is the $250K max per year in direct costs, is that customary in NIH? And I guess it seems like because the modular budget is set up the way, it seems like that's like more common.
Yeah, so most grants are under $250,000 in direct research costs per year. Large grants are considered over 250. Really large grants are considered over 500. You need to get program officer permission to submit a grant with more than $500,000 of research costs in any one year. You do not need to get permission to submit one between 250 and 500.
Yeah, and I guess the other thing is, like, this audience is many assistant professors and people earlier in their careers, when you're more likely to write your own individual proposals. But I'm at Beckman, where we do a lot of collaborative stuff. So the stuff I'm seeing at Beckman is usually bigger, because we're doing like center grant proposals and stuff like that, and those are bigger scale.
Exactly. So if you're, an assistant professor and you're writing your first NIH grant, one of the mistakes you could make is you could be naive in thinking you can do more work than you can do, and your budget's too big. So reviewers will pick up on that, especially if you check early investigator status. If you're proposing like a $450,000 a year research study as a junior investigator and you're the sole and primary PI, rethink your strategy. You want to be, you want to maybe choose a project for your initial NIH project being a little bit more manageable. So you don't have so much research staff that you're supervising, so that you're not trying to answer every question that you want to answer. Just, try to rein yourself in a little bit to make it reasonable. And this critique comes up a lot with junior, early stage investigators. Reviewers are like, well, this person's never done an independent research project before, and yet, they're asking for $400,000 every year for 5 years. Maybe there's another way we can support this person, but it's not going to be by this proposal, right? Yeah, so just word to the wise. So just some final words, I think. before we stop for questions, yeah, again, try to do these other things in your less creative times or when you don't have big chunks of time. But don't wait till the last minute to do these forms because it's going to be a pain, especially the first time you submit an NIH grant and you don't have any experience to fall back on. Again, the best teacher is experience. And so when you go through and submit your first NIH grant, you're going to learn a whole heck of a lot. And always the second proposal is going to be better than the first one. But you learn by experience. And so I highly recommend you submit one, go through the process, be as competitive as you can be, and hopefully you'll get funded. Then you don't have to write one every year. I'm done, Maggie.
We did have a question that I would like to talk about this. Is campus providing support to recruitment of underrepresented minority GRAs? What are new campus policies or initiatives in this area?
I know that the Graduate College, I believe, does have some URM scholarships and fellowships that they apply. So
Yeah,
they're very competitive. I know that.
Yeah, the other thing, my first thought was, so first of all, I know that the campus is committed to diversity and inclusion, but in terms of actual pots of money available to recruit specific people in specific departments, I'm not sure about that, but Beckman doesn't recruit students per se either, so I wouldn't know that. I do know that in the Graduate College, there is an Office of External Fellowships, and they have an online searchable database, and they try to track hundreds of fellowships in which a variety of criteria are used for funding, and so those could include diversity. At Beckman, I do know that we have a few student awards programs, and so these are not recruitment things to get people to campus, but once you're here, we have several different awards, one of which is the Nadine Barry Smith Memorial Fellow. We call it a Memorial Fellowship. It's $4,000 award made to female students who do medical imaging research. So there's like an example of that, but there's like hundreds of examples like that in this external fellowships database.
Yeah, I do believe that the Graduate College also has some money, but it's very competitive. So if you've got an underrepresented student you're trying to recruit to your laboratory as a doctoral student, for instance, there might be a way the grad college can, that you can apply, or that student can apply to the grad college to get some funding support. You may also want to talk to your department head. Departments are, the whole university is very interested in increasing diversity in every unit. And so department heads may have resources or know of resources that can help you recruit a particular student if you're interested in them and they're interested in you.
Every year, Beckman has a graduate fellow competition. It opens every January, and and right now we have our postdoc fellow competition open. And so, as we say on our website, one of our values is also diversity. So we have a faculty committee rate all the applicants, and then the director will do the final selections, and that's where diversity comes in. So, if the top 10 people all want to do imaging, or they all want to, if they're all one particular ethnic or racial group, then it's like, no, we want to break it up. So in that sense, we try to be diverse, but again, we're not actually saying on the call that we don't have any like quotas or anything set up, but we want to attract a broad range of people. We actually changed our eligibility criteria to have your PhD within the last 10 years for exactly this purpose of people who might have gone away from academia to do something else for a while, and they're going to come back and they want to start a new postdoc at Beckman. So we do work hard with people to try to get a broad audience to apply. Anyway, and I put in the chat the link to the external fellowship webpage. So that's where all grad students and you guys can also go and see what's about there.
All right. If there are no other questions, I think we're going to wrap up. So next week is the last week of the seminar series. We'll be talking about responding to reviews. So a lot about what to do after you've submitted a proposal. Maybe it got to the review, or maybe it wasn't discussed. And then we'll talk about what to do about resubmitting, whether you should resubmit, and how to submit a successful resubmission. So hope to see you all next week. Thank you again to Jeff and Patty. It was great having you here.
Thanks mostly to Jeff. That was really great. Thank you.
Thank you. See you, everybody. Good luck on your proposals.
Yes, thanks. Keep going. The only way you'll never get funded is if you never apply. So come on, you can do it. Apply.
See you later.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.